Hello, good evening. Good to have you here. Good evening. I heard nothing. Okay, good evening. Hi. Welcome to Hoed. I'm Feba Sukmana. I'm a journalist born and raised in Indonesia, and now I'm working and living in the Netherlands, and I will be your host for tonight. And this evening, we are going to talk about Revolusi. And we will not only talk about what happened between 1945 until 1950, but we will also talk about its impact across generations and political/historical borders. It sounds very difficult, but it's a simple thing to talk about, I guess, I hope. And this program is organized by Beyond Walls and facilitated by the Rode Hoed. I want to start with a question. What comes in your mind when you hear the word Revolusi? Wow, nice book. I also have it. I haven't read it, but I have it at home. Maybe we can take this. This is a very beautiful book. Maybe we can put it here for the evening, for the sake of Revolusi. Okay, some of you might think about the bambu runcing, the pemudas, the Indonesian resistance, the war, the blood, all the dramatical things. But some of you might think about your grandfathers serving the knil in a land far away in Indonesia. But I want to take us to see just another part of revolution. So that's why I want to introduce you to Hyrule Anwar. Hyrule Anwar is an Indonesian poet. Sorry?
You ask us what do we think when you use the word revolution. But revolutions have taken place all over the world. And maybe that's also good to make it broader than only this concentration on 45, 50 Indonesia.
Yes, we will take that into account, and we will talk. Of course, it's broader than only 45 and 50, but we are going to start with first Hyrule Anwar. Yes, Hyrule Anwar was a prominent poet in Indonesia. Everybody knows Hyrule Anwar, and he was also involved in Revolusi together with other artists in Indonesia. And his poem Kerawang Bekasi was well known. The poem is about the massacre of Rawagede in 1947. It is very well known in Indonesia. But for tonight, I want to introduce you to his other poem, and that is Aku. I'm not going to read this aloud if that's what you're thinking about, so why not? No. But I want us to look at this poem. And I find this poem very beautiful because, I chose this poem because it shows us the struggles and the spirit of the I, the Aku. And this spirit, this exact same spirit and struggles, we will find it in the people who were involved in the Revolusi. And of course, we are touching upon the grand narratives of history, but we will focus on small stories, local personal stories, and how their stories reflect the bigger picture. And we are not going to talk about Java because you can read that all over the newspaper, all over books, but we are going to Bali and to Maluku and also to Papua a little bit. And that we will do it with our guest, Anne-Lot Hoek, Tamara Soukotta, and Cokorda Agung Pudak. So we're going to Bali with Anne-Lot Hoek. Welcome, Anne-Lot. Yes, please sit down. Okay, I'm going to introduce you first. Of course, people already know who you are, but I have to introduce you. So Anne-Lot Hoek is an investigative journalist and historian. She writes, among others, for NRC Handelsblad, Vrij Nederland en De Groene Amsterdammer. De Groene Amsterdammer, moet ik goed zeggen. Okay. She recently made her debut with The Strijd om Bali. And from 2017 to 2019, she was also involved in the research project of NIOT, and that is Independence, Decolonization, and Violence and War in 1945 to 1950. And in this research, she wrote an article for an edited volume with Dutch and Indonesian researcher. But it is not a part of the results and book that will be presented tomorrow morning. Okay, so Anne-Lot, let's start. What can you tell us about what happened in East Indonesia during the revolution?
Yes, the East Indonesia was actually a very important part of the Revolusi, but it's very strange that it's been quite neglected in historiography. What you said, we really focus on the center, on Java, and we have not so much knowledge about what was going on in other areas. And Eastern Indonesia was actually very important for the Dutch political strategy because the Lieutenant Governor General Van Mook, he set up a plan to divide Indonesia in different states. And Eastern Indonesia was a very important state for the Dutch to counterweight the Republic from Sukarno.
Okay, so the plan of Van Mook is to establish Republik Indonesia Timur. That's the East Indonesian Republic.
Yeah.
And Bali was important because it was already a tourist destination even before World War II.
Yes.
So in this way, the Dutch wanted to show the world that Bali is...
Yes, it was very important for the Dutch that the East Indonesia had an image of loyalty to the Dutch because they had to some sort of show internationally that they still had reason to be there in Indonesia and to have some sort of justifying their power base. And Eastern Indonesia was therefore very important for them, and Bali especially because Bali had this loyal image to the Dutch, of this very peaceful island. And the fact that in reality there was a very active Republican movement going on Bali, that's something they didn't expect. And that was a very big problem, actually, for the Dutch.
But how did they reoccupy Bali then?
Bali was occupied on the 2nd of March 1946, and that was half a year after the proclamation of independence. So the Balinese were not expecting the Dutch back at all, but they did come, and the Dutch were very surprised about the fierce resistance that was going on there. And there was the son of a nobleman, Igusti Ngurah, he was 29 years old at that time. He was leading the Republican movement. And there was a very strong resistance. And the Dutch basically occupied Bali by using quite a colonial strategy that's similar to the Aceh strategy that they used way before in colonial times. So it was making good friends with the elites, with the kings, and being very severe towards the Republican movement. And that was very, very, very violent.
Yeah, and you also said that the words that the Dutch used to describe the war, it was similar to Aceh.
Yeah, that is something that I found very significant when I studied all these reports from civil servants and military, that they used all these words that they were using before the war, because most of them had been stationed on Bali before the war. So they came back with all these colonial ideas that were still there in place. At the same time, Van Mook was sort of saying, we're now into a post-colonial relationship, etc. But in reality, especially also these civil servants had these ideas of we, as the Dutch, have to be like the strong person here, the father to the people.
Okay,
and they used words, the military used a lot of words like kwaadwillig, onverzoenlijk, all these kind of colonial words that they used for resistance in colonial times. Yes. And also het onderwerpen of a village, like the submission of a village.
Okay.
And these were things that you can also find in books about Aceh, and that was very striking for me to see how these ideas were still completely in place in 1946.
Yeah, and you also mentioned the Republican Igusti Ngurah Rai. In Indonesia, we know Igusti Ngurah Rai as national hero.
Yeah.
But back to the kingdoms in Bali. So, how can you sketch the situation among the Balinese royals or
Royals.
kingdoms?
Yeah, there were 8 kings in Bali at that time, and before colonial times there were also kingdoms in Bali. But when the Dutch came, they sort of made these power structures very rigid or very, and in general it was very fluid actually. So the Dutch used the divide and conquer tactic to give the one royal much more power than the others. So there were a lot of internal conflicts going on already between families when the Dutch came back in 1946. And then they used the same strategy of divide and conquer. So you could see that if one royal was not cooperating with the Dutch, they just would send them home and take another royal to help them to get control over the island. And because the power structures are very much strong from the Balinese royals, the Dutch understood that it was very important for them to have the support of the kings.
Yeah.
And i.s.m also knew he had to have the support of the king. So the kings were in a difficult position.
They were torn between the Republican and the Dutch.
Yes. And the story on Bali was actually that all the kings were on the side of the Dutch. But that was actually not true. When you go look very closely, you can see that some of them were actually very much pro-Republican, also because a lot of their children actually aligned with the Republic. So they had a different idea about the future of Indonesia than their fathers. So within the families, it was also a very difficult situation.
So very complicated on the ground.
Yes.
And before we move on to the story of Bali, you did a research on Bali. Too bad your book isn't here. It's another book.
I have it upstairs.
Oh, you have it upstairs.
No, it was...
This is another book. It's not your book, but it's okay. Maybe we can put it later here.
Yeah.
So you did a research on Bali. How did you do it?
I did it together with 2 fantastic Balinese young women, Niketut Suryani and Imade Friska Aswarini. And without their support, I would have never been able to do the research because I don't speak Balinese. And the most old people speak Balinese. It's very complicated, also the language to read. And with them, it was so much more easy for me to find people to interview, to go to places, and also it was very nice to have conversation about their culture and about all that. So it was a joint cooperation, and we spoke to about 100 people on Bali, more or less.
But what was your reason to go to Bali, except the beautiful weather, the beautiful people, and beautiful land? But why did you choose to, we're going to Bali instead of, we have a lot of archives here?
Yeah, that's a good question. For me, it's completely impossible to do research as such without going to the place where the history happened. And some people say, but on Bali, there's not an archive there. But I think there's an archive, but it's a different kind of archive. It's not the archive that we're used to. You go to the National Archive. And
what do you mean by different?
Well, they don't have, like what we have in the National Archive, all these well-organized documentation. I found quite little documentation, but the archive is actually quite rich in terms of local stories, monuments that still have a lot of dates and names, and there's always people there who can tell about an event. There's also memoirs of veterans and local historians who wrote little stories about what happened in the village. So for me, it was the challenge was to combine the 2 archives.
The Dutch archives and the Indonesian, the Balinese archive.
For instance, there was one situation in Karangasem that in the village they had a big drum placed somewhere that was their memory of the war. And then when you start asking questions, they tell me that, somebody was drumming, or how do you say that? Playing the drums. And it was the idea to warn the village that the Dutch were coming. And the person was actually shot right there. And then other people got shot, and they had the whole story around the drum, and also they made a monument with the names and the date. And then when you go and look into the Dutch archive, you can actually find the incident. But what is written in the Dutch archive is only like 3 lines with expedition in this village, and we shot, 3 terrorists shot on the run, something like that. So it's very vague, it's not clear, the other party is a criminal. That's the only thing you can find. So you have to go there to hear the actual story, what was going on.
And I think that you heard the actual stories. It brought you to a lot of interesting objects that emphasize the complex situation between all the groups. And we are going to highlight 3 of them. The first one you found was a letter from the resistance fighter, the I Gusti Ngurah Rai, the national hero of Indonesia. How and where did you find it? This is the letter, right?
Yeah, this is the letter. And
too bad I cannot...
yeah, your Indonesian is better than mine.
My Indonesian is perfect, but I cannot see this. This is too
yeah,
small.
The letter is meant... in Gusti Ngurah Rai, when the Dutch came on Bali on the 2nd of March, he was still on Java.
Okay.
And he came back. It was very difficult for him to come back. He had to come back with all local boats. They just have to try to cross the sea. And the Dutch were already patrolling very much. So it was very difficult. And a boat before him got shot. Then he went back. And then a day later, they tried again. And they managed to come here on Bali. And then on April, one of the first things he did was write this letter to the kings of Bali and ask them for their support. Yeah. Because he knew it was very difficult for him to win the revolution without the support of the kings. Yeah. So he really hoped that they would be on his side. And for me it's interesting because you have all the discussion now about looted art, and now it's the discussion about looted archive in the Rijksmuseum exposition. This is also looted archive in the sense that I found it in the archive of a civil servant who took a lot of stuff from the Republican resistance.
So you have found this in the Netherlands?
Yes, yes.
What did it do here?
Exactly, yeah.
Why?
So I told the family of Ngurah Rai that the letter is here, and also Sudiani is now, she sent it to the family, and they are asking to they really like to have it back, especially because they don't have so many documents. Course, and it's an original document signed by Ngurah Rai. Yeah,
and I think this is very patriotic or something, because you see he started the letter with Merdeka. This is very interesting. And the second one was the ring.
The ring, yeah, I have it here also.
Oh, you brought it. You're not allowed to. No. But yeah, this is the ring of Panjitisna.
The ring of Panjitisna, yeah.
Okay, can you first elaborate who Panjitisna is and how you got the ring?
Yeah,
because I wanted to. This is from my great-grandfather.
The Panjitisna was actually before the Second World War, he was a novel writer, and he wrote a lot about how he envisioned a better society, like, how do you say that? He was very anti-colonial. And he was not anti-Dutch, he was anti-colonial.
Okay, he was anti-colonial, but
against the system.
Okay, against the system, but not against...
Not against the Dutch.
So you can like this person? He's not anti-Dutch?
He was a very nationalistic person, but a very open-minded, spiritual kind of person. Okay. And he didn't want to get in the footsteps of his father to become the Raja of Buleleng. But during the Second World War, somehow...
So he was basically a prince?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, but he didn't want to be part of the colonial system, and the kings were part of the colonial system. So that's why he didn't want to. But in the Second World War, he did become king. I think the Japanese just appointed him. I'm not sure how that went. But when the Dutch came back, he was in a very difficult position because he had a lot of Dutch friends, but at the other hand, he had a lot of friends at the Republican side, and he made his own choice. He was against violence from the Dutch, but also against violence from the revolution, and he just wanted to work on development for his island. And it's interesting because it shows that it's not black and white. People had own ideas about what the new Indonesia should be like. And for him, that was a different kind of story. And one of the people that he worked together with very closely was Henk Franke, and was a Dutch missionary, Protestant missionary, who had the same ideas. They were on the same page, and they were all kind of doing developmental work on Bali. And when Franke went back to the Netherlands, he gave him this ring, and it's a very old ring, and you can see it here. Yeah, my father is a jeweler, so he already looked at it. He said it's a couple of 100 years old. And the idea is that everybody who gets the ring is now part of the royal family. And
Oh,
so
no, now you're royal.
Yeah.
But how did you get the ring?
Yeah, during my book presentation, the son of Henk Franke, who got the ring from the Panjatisner out of friendship, gave it to me, and that was a very special moment. And now I have to decide what to do with the ring. So I didn't make up my mind yet, because to bring it to the museum here is also complicated in a way. Yeah, you can
but
bring
you know
it back
how to
to
find
Bali.
me, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
we have to discuss this.
Yeah.
What's
We have to discuss this later.
Yeah, but for me, it shows that there was also friendship amongst Balinese and Dutch
yeah.
during Revolusi.
Yeah. And this is a happy ending story, I guess, because you have the ring. And the third one is also very interesting. You came across the shirt of Cokorda Rai Pudak.
Yeah.
Who was he?
Cokorda Rai Pudak was one of the leaders of the Republican movement in the Regency of Gianyar. And he, together with Cokorda Gede Rai, they set up a revolutionary organization helping Noorag Rai in his fight. And they were actually both members of the Puputan Palace, which was a rival royal family of the king of Gianyar. The king of Gianyar was Ide Anak Agung Gede Agung. Okay. He became a very important person, not only on Bali, but also in the diplomacy and the negotiations with the Dutch. And later on in Indonesia, he even became a national hero, which is very controversial because he was very violent on Bali. And he had them both executed.
Okay.
And,
I have to stop you there. Because we can also find this shirt in the Revolusi exhibition at the Rijksmuseum. And also for this exhibition, Bjorn Walls made a video portrait about Cokorda Rai Pudak. And we will take a look at the 2-minute fragment of the video. This is it.
Bapak saya, Cokorda Rai Pudak. Beliau lahir tahun 1903. Sebelum beliau meninggal, beliau sendiri mengirim surat kepada namanya i.s.m, yaitu masih beraya saya, tetapi ada nama lain namanya i.s.m juga, tetapi yang memihak nikah. Lalu orang yang membawa itu menyangka daging yang sudah dia tuju bukan daging yang diminta untuk tuju yang masuk keluarga saya. Nah, yang menerima itu adalah daging yang memihak nikah. Lalu dibawalah surat itu kepada orang yang memihak nikah. Lalu diserbulah ke Petang, bapak saya di sana di Petang. Lalu dibawa di Kedewatan, disiksa di sana. Pakaiannya penuh dengan lubang peluru, bajunya robek, dan kemudian entah bagaimana saya sendiri tidak melihat karena masih di penjara. Lalu dibawalah ke rumah. Dan di rumah, waktu saya keluar dari penjara, bapak saya masih dikuburkan tanpa bentuk yang normal. Kuburan tutup dengan tanah saja. Nah, waktu saya tiba di rumah, saya buat kuburan itu dan saya isi di belakang kuburan itu, "Aku untukmu." Lalu dilaporkan saya bahwa kata-kata itu harus dihapus. begitu orang yang nikah mengatakan kepada saya, tidak boleh ada kata aku untukmu.
Yes, this is one of the most touching stories in the exhibition of Revolusi. And I can imagine it must have been very intense for you to come across this kind of valuable historical objects. How did you end up with this shirt? Because you tended to get a lot of things from Bali.
Yeah, but it was actually a big coincidence actually. I interviewed the grandson of Chukwudi Rai, the friend of his father. He was...
this is another family, right?
Another family, yeah. And Friska knew the grandson. And then he told us that very nearby lived Chukwudi Rai Pudak, who was actually the son of Chukwudi Rai Pudak, who had also been a veteran or a fighter. So we interviewed him, and then he told us all the stories, and also about him being imprisoned while his father was being shot, and he heard the news there in the prison. So it was a very interesting and sad story also. And then at the end of the story, he took out the shirt from a cupboard and showed it to us.
Just like that?
He said, I have the shirt. And it took us a while to understand what we were seeing. But that's how it...
Wow, that's very special, I guess. Like you have built the connection with the people there in Bali.
Yeah, definitely.
And also joining with us via Zoom, one of the sons of Chukwudi Rai Pudak, so the brother of the man you saw in the video. His name is Chukwudi Agung Pudak, and he lives in the Czech Republic, so he doesn't have to stay up late for us. Chukwudi Agung Pudak was only 4 years old when his father died. And he also has a very vivid memory about the Revolusi and the impact for him and his family. We are going to try to talk to him in English, but in case he speaks to us in Indonesian, then I will translate it to you. Selamat malam, Pak Agung. Oh, I cannot hear the voice. He said something, but we didn't hear anything. Selamat malam, Pak. Yes. Okay, we are going to try to figure that out. But the story of Chukwudi Agung Pudak, he lives in Czech Republic, is also very interesting because he is an exile from Indonesia. Do you know the story of him?
Yeah, but I'm not sure why he's an exile from Indonesia. So that's also...
Well, I accidentally know about that. So, no, I've talked to him this morning, and he told me that he was studying at the Czech Republic at the time of 1965, the massacre of Indonesian. I have to say the coup from Suharto to get into the power in Indonesia. So he was sent to Czech Republic to study by Sukarno. And all the people all over the world, I guess, some in the Netherlands, some in China, and some in Russia, and some in Czech Republic, they were sent by Sukarno, and they lost their nationality at that time. Because Suharto told them, like, okay, you have to choose. You can come back to Indonesia, you can get your Indonesian passport, but you have to support me. And most of these students, they didn't like Suharto, of course. Who liked Suharto anyway? But okay, so because they refused to support Suharto, they lost their nationality, and then they had to live in exile. And I think until now he lives in the Czech Republic. He hasn't.
Too bad that we cannot.
It's too bad that it's.
No.
Oops.
No.
Who is that? Hello.
No, ya.
Selamat malam, Bapak.
Ya, selamat malam.
Good evening.
Good
Good to
morning.
have you here. Okay, Bapak, Anne-Lot has told us about the story of your father and her discovering the shirt. And I want to ask you, if you see your father's shirt, what comes in your mind?
I want
Can,
to show
okay,
you in English,
okay.
but only slowly, yes. After seeing my father's shot in video and my brother's interview, my heart and mind mixed from sadness to pride.
Okay, so his heart mixed with sadness and pride. Kenapa sedih, Pak? Why?
It's sad to imagine how many father was abused and then shot. It saddened me to think of my brother's time in prison. He told me that it is often heartbreaking to hear the scream of the fighters being tortured in other cell. Then I'm also feeling proud because my two immediate families had a role as a fighters to defend the Republic of Indonesia.
Okay, so he is sad that if he heard the story about his brother in the video in the jail, he told him sad stories, but also about the father and about the T-shirt, the shirt. Of course, it is very sad, but he is also proud that his family is part of the Indonesian resistance. Bapak, let's switch to Indonesian. Kita ngomong pakai bahasa Indonesia aja nggak apa-apa ya, Pak ya? Bapak, kalau misalnya kita ngomongin revolusi, memori apa sih Pak yang paling Bapak ingat? What's your vivid memory about the revolusi in Indonesia?
Menurut saya, revolusi itu adalah suatu tingkat di mana suatu negara itu ingin berdiri sendiri.
Okay, so revolusi is the Pak, tunggu ya Pak, aku terjemahin dulu. So revolusi is the time when a country try to to get its independence. Silakan Pak.
Ya. Jadi kalau revolusi itu bisa menang, jadi suatu bangsa itu bisa berdiri dan menentukan nasibnya sendiri.
Okay, so a country should be able to get its independence and to. Okay, this is the so many things at once. Okay, so Bapak, kalau misalnya waktu Bapak kecil, yang paling Bapak ingat waktu zaman revolusi apa sih Pak? When you were little, what did you remember about the revolusi time?
Waktu itu kehidupan aja adalah sangat susah.
Okay.
Sukar.
Okay, so it was difficult back then. Susahnya gimana Pak?
Tidak ada listrik, tidak ada lampu, cuman dipakai dengan dipakai dengan minyak tanah atau minyak kelapa.
Okay, so they didn't have electricity. They didn't have lamps. Thank you.
Lalu kalau ada yang punya cuman sepeda sudah senang karena hampir tidak ada yang punya mobil.
Okay, and you would be very happy if you have a bicycle because not everybody had a bicycle.
Saya waktu itu juga tidak punya sepatu atau sandal, tidak memakai sepatu atau sandal, jadi kaki.
Okay, so what he also remembered is that he didn't even have a sandal, let alone shoes. And
lalu waktu saya masuk sekolah kelas 1 tahun 1948, saya di sekolah tidak dapat buku dengan kertas, tetapi dikasih suatu papan dari batu untuk menulis.
Okay, so when he went to school, he didn't get a piece of paper and pen, but instead of that, he got like a stone. Yeah?
Lei.
Okay. Okay, in Indonesia, I think it's called karas because my
Karas,
mom,
in
karas,
Bali,
right,
in
Pak?
Balinese. In Balinese, karas. I don't
Yeah.
know in Jawa or the
So
other
it
part.
was like a stone with.
Yeah.
Oh, you also got it back then. Okay. So you know what he meant without me. Telling you too much about it. Oke, Pak, kalau ngomongin tadi di video diomongin kalau keluarga Bapak nggak bisa kasih pelebon yang proper ke Pak Cokorda, ke bapaknya Bapak. Ini Bapak bisa ceritain nggak gimana akhirnya Bapak bisa kasih seremoni yang pantas untuk keluarga Bapak. So at first, his father didn't get a proper funeral as we saw in the video, but years after, I think this is the grave, right? This the temporary grave.
Nggak kelihatan.
Sorry,
Dengar saya. Videonya ini nggak kelihatan. Ibu nggak kelihatan.
Iya Pak, belum Pak. Nanti sebentar lagi saya kelihatan. I want to ask him what's the story behind the pelebon. That's the Balinese ceremony for the funeral. Bapak bisa cerita soal gimana cara?
Bahasa Indonesia.
Silakan.
Kalau di Bali yang beragama Hindu, kalau meninggal biasanya itu akan dibakar, tidak ditanam langsung. Tetapi kalau ada yang belum punya biaya dan juga untuk kadang-kadang juga menanti artinya hari yang baik, jadi itu bisa sementara ditanam di bumi.
Yeah, so Balinese, Bali, the people of Bali, they are cremated normally, but if you haven't got the chance to do that, the proper ceremony, then they were buried like the father here. Ini tahun berapa ya Pak ya? This is the pelebon, I guess, right? Yeah, the cremation in 1957. Ceritanya gimana tuh Pak sebelum ada upacara pelebon? Karena kan harus digali lagi ya Pak ya ininya.
Waktu itu digali lagi hari itu dan saya masih ingat sekali bahwa yang menggali itu yang menjadi utama adalah penggalinya kakak saya, Cokorda dalam budak yang diinterview tadi di video. Dan saya juga menyaksikan langsung bagaimana akhirnya setelah dibongkar semua kuburannya, sudah kelihatan tulang-tulang dari ayah saya.
Yeah, so his big brother in the video and they dug up the remains of the father in the grave, and then they put all the remains for the ceremony of pelebon. And this is the ceremony of pelebon with so many people. Bapak, kenapa sih Pak seremoni pelebon ini penting untuk orang Bali?
Seremoni ini penting karena kita anggap bahwa seorang yang sudah meninggal sudah nanti rohnya sudah akan meninggalkan badan kasarnya dan akan pergi ke dunia yang lain. Jadi artinya kalau secara kasarnya ke 4 dimensi.
Okay, so Balinese people believe that if you died, your spirit, your soul will go to another place.
Untuk supaya bisa aman dan bisa tempatnya dekat sama dengan Tuhan, menurut kebiasaan di Bali itu harus diadakan upacara.
Okay, so if you want your soul to come back to God or to the place, to the good place next to God, then they will organize this ceremony. Bapak, pertanyaan terakhir nih Pak.
Ya,
Impact terbesar dari revolusi dalam hidup Bapak tuh apa sih Pak? What is the biggest impact of revolution in your life?
bahwa saya merasa dunia terbuka.
Okay, the world was open.
Jadi tidak ada yang artinya bangsa asing yang bisa menghalangi kemana jalan yang akan dipilih suatu bangsa kalau sudah merdeka.
Okay, so he sees it as a very positive thing. The world was open, and Indonesia can decide its own life, destination, and future. Bapak Cokorda Agung Rai, terima kasih ya Pak sudah bergabung dengan kami. Thank you for joining us.
Ya,
Sehat-sehat ya Pak.
ya, saya juga terima kasih banyak.
Stay safe. Thank you so much for joining us. And Anne-Lot, I will kick you out from the podium. You will come back later for the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Feba.
And now I want to invite Tamara Soukotta to join me at the stage. Welcome, Tamara.
Thank you.
I will also introduce you.
Yes, please.
Tamara is a researcher, PhD candidate, and lecturer affiliated with the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. And she is currently working on a PhD thesis on the social consequences of the conflict in Maluku between 1999 and 2004.
Correct, thank you.
And you want to say something about you wearing a mask?
Yes, I'm very sorry if you cannot see my expression, but I'm not one of the fittest who might survive the pandemic, so it's necessary for me to keep this on. Thank you.
Okay. Tamara, when we talk about Moluccans, Maluku people, we talk about a very complicated position. We will elaborate on that, but I want to start with a question that I always have in mind, and maybe many Indonesians with me. Why did the Moluccans choose the Dutch side?
The
Why?
question is whether we actually chose the Dutch side.
Okay.
I think it's a very complicated situation where after independence and including during revolution, we are mostly associated with KNIL and those who fight for the Dutch side. But the question was always whether we actually made that decision to be Dutch soldier. Now, to put it into context, Maluku was colonized much longer than other parts of Indonesia. And colonization is not only about physical occupation of a particular place or land. It's also about changing of the whole system, including belief system. It's also about erasure of knowledges, of your beliefs, of your gods even. And it's about changing your whole self.
Okay, so
in a way.
So you what you want to say is maybe that there was not only physical colonization,
Yes.
but also mental colonization.
I wouldn't say mental, I would use the word subjectivity. So when you are colonized and your land was taken, your whole livelihood was taken and changed, then at one point becoming a soldier is not an option. When the Dutch need soldiers, then they recruited from the Moluccans, from the area that also religiously they already converted. So these are people that are easier to be included in the Dutch military force. Now, at the same time, becoming soldiers is, in my understanding, the ultimate colonization. It's the ultimate defeat, the ultimate subjectification, because the essence of being a soldier is complete obedience. You don't question anything. So becoming a soldier for Moluccans, it's not a pleasant thing. It was also something that, it's not whether I want this water or something else. It's not necessarily an option. You ended up becoming a soldier.
Okay, earlier you also mentioned, I'm particularly interested in the fact that that the Dutch used religion as a means of colonization. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I think it's part of the gold, gospel, and glory, and the missionaries were part of. You have military, and you have the traders, but you also have missionaries, and it's part of the assumptions that these people are not necessarily people first. They're not necessarily human, or maybe subhuman. And one way for us to save them or to help them to become human or civilized is to introduce them to religion.
Okay, so you said that by religion the Dutch were trying to save the people or to form the people?
It's one of the way, right? So it's one of the way to humanize these creatures, let's say so. But at the same time, then later on, it also served the purpose of, creating obedient subject.
Okay, I have to let that sink in.
Sorry.
No problem. And as I said, the position of the Moluccans was and still is very complicated because in Indonesia they were seen as as traitors. But when they came here in the Netherlands, the country didn't welcome them. So, how do you see this?
Just like that, first of all, I think it's important that Moluccans never actually moved. The Dutch came to Maluku and claimed the area, but also then subjectified the people. And then after the Indonesian independence, this area become parts of the new republic. The people never actually crossed the border, as one of the decolonial Gloria Ansaldúa speaks about the case in Latin America or in New Mexico that was annexed by United States. The border, we didn't cross the border. The border crossed us, and I can relate to this in the case of Maluku. You didn't become Dutch by choice, as if you go to a certain place and reclaim that nationality. It was an identity that is forced upon you. Same with being Indonesian. Now, under the Dutch, as the colonies, as I mentioned before, we were not necessarily considered as full human beings, right? And then we are already turned into soldiers. And during the War of Independence, including, we were also, if you're under the Dutch forces, then you're fighting the Republican Pemuda and other people. Now, that's not necessarily a choice first. And then, under the Indonesian Republic, this area, along with its people, become part of Indonesia. But how can you be a traitor of something that did not exist before?
Yeah.
But still, that is the narrative that sticks. That is the identity that sticks, as if the identity of Moluccans is only Dutch soldier.
Yeah.
Now, the part of not being necessarily accepted as fully human beings when included as soldiers was proven when Moluccans arrived in the Netherlands, and you see that how they were treated.
Yeah.
So you're a tool for this war of power.
Okay, so like the Moluccans didn't or don't get the place in the narrative of Indonesia as well as narrative of the Dutch.
Yes, I think if you see the map of Indonesia, eastern part is at the margin. And I think the position of Maluku in Indonesia is still at the margin. And during colonial time, it's also margin. It exists in support or to benefit the center, but not necessarily the center. And probably will not be center.
Okay, we will elaborate on that later, but your work is about the impact of colonialism. So maybe can you first explain to me what's the difference between colonialism and coloniality and decolonism and decoloniality
So
before
I think,
we
yes,
go into the subject?
I think the term decolonization is rather popular these days. Now, when we speak about colonialism, we speak about a system, also an ideal, right? Now, when we speak about coloniality, it's the underlying logic of that system of oppression. That underlying logic includes segregation, separation, hierarchy, for example, and including practices like divide and conquer. Now, when we speak about decolonization, it's important to separate it into two. First is the decolonization as in the former or still colonizers leaving their former colonies in the 1940s onwards. That is decolonization period as well. But then when we speak about decolonization in terms of coloniality, then you have decoloniality. That's about the linking from that logic of colonization. Because coloniality or colonialism even does not necessarily stop when the colonizers left their colony physically, because the system is there, the logic is still there, the practices remains, the violence remains.
Yeah, and according to you, the system is still there. The colonial system is still there in Maluku until now.
I think it's everywhere. No, I mean like the fact that we ended up with the same system. After colonization, the only option to exist is as a nation state, for example. So in a way, to link it with Revolusi, we change power, we change faces, but the system remains.
Yeah, and what do you think is missing in the decolonization or decoloniality discourse? Which one do I have to use? Decoloniality or decolonization discourse?
Decolonization, perhaps.
Decolonization discourse regarding the Moluccans.
I think this is a process that is unfinished. What was finished or considered completed is the fact that the area was, the former colonizer, in this case the Dutch, left the area physically. Whether they actually left completely, that's a big question mark, right? Because in global system as well, the West still is the center of power, and the former colonized area becomes the periphery to support the center. Now that process, okay, we can say that is completed, but the remnants of colonization, the impact of the hundreds of years of violence remains, and it is not solved until now. I think in many cases the impact, the War of Independence, the revolution that comes after the issue of RMS, Permesta, all these wars and even recent conflicts, one way or another you will find the link to the colonial violence.
Yeah, and in an earlier interview you mentioned that the grand narratives of history, in this case the narrative of Indonesia and the narrative of the Netherlands, are problematic. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, grand narratives of, history. Now, history is always related with grand narratives, right? One truth, one narrative, because this narrative is also related, history is also related to nation-building process. Especially in the case of Indonesia, for example, this is a state that is formed by unification of area. Prior to European colonization, these are several states, several nations. Now you have to become one nation state. So you need something to bind that. And one of the things is that you and I learned the same history. And that is the history of Indonesia. Now Indonesia is a huge country. We didn't experience every period similarly. Now on the other side, you also have history from the perspective of the Netherlands, from the Dutch. And this serves to build nationalism within the Dutch people. So in that sense, nationalism will always, history will always connect it to nationalism, and in a way it's a kind of propaganda, basically. Yeah. Because to form this one story and become history, you have to erase many others that doesn't match the grand narratives that you want.
So now you want us to erase the grand narrative?
Well,
please say yes.
Well, in a way, perhaps to reduce history to just a story. I think, I'm not a historian, so I apologize in advance, but I believe in stories rather than history. And I think what I want to do, or what I'm trying to do also in my work, is to provide spaces for all these stories to coexist together. instead of just one truth and one story. Because if you only allow one truth and one story, people will kill each other for it to become the one telling their story.
Yeah. But yes, that deserves an applause, of course. But if you reject the grand narratives, like I went to school in Indonesia, and of course you and I shared the same pelajaran sejarah, history lessons. If you reject these stories, the grand narratives, do historical events still have meaning for you? Like, how do you see 17 August in Indonesia, or commemorations of war victims in the Netherlands? How do you place those things?
I think those historical events will still have meanings, but then it doesn't have the same meaning for everybody. Now, the party that would not be happy with rejection of these grand narratives are the states. Now, regular people perhaps would be happy if their stories or the stories of their grandfather, grandmothers would be told openly and accepted as part of, narratives of that period, instead of just one story that they cannot relate to. Now, I struggle with pelajaran sejarah because I cannot relate to that. But I do understand that for those historical events, I have family stories about that events. Now, then 17th of August would be, given different meanings according to how you experience that. And then when we open the possibility for other meanings, perhaps the Indonesian nation state would not be very happy about that. Same with, I think, Remembrance Day here. It will become very different. And I don't think everybody would be very happy if we allow other stories, because I think one of the questions that was and always being asked here is, how do you commemorate something like that when at the same time you're doing the same thing in other places? So can you accept that? Will you accept that? Are you ready to accept that? Because this is one of the consequences of allowing other stories to come into play.
Yeah, then it will become, I think, more chaotic, just like the Revolusi period at that time.
It would not. Well, all events are always chaotic, right? Life is not that clean cut. But to accept that, there are many versions. Not all of us are there experiencing the same thing, and for one event or for all kind of wars, we cannot just be either victims or perpetrators, but we can be both at the same time.
Yeah. I'm also interested when you said that you don't have any feelings about Indonesian history lessons, because I come from Java, of course, the center of the world, but did it have something to do with the position of the Maluku people, the Moluccans, in the history of Indonesia, but also in the history of the Netherlands?
Yes, and grand narratives is always about linearity, right? You have dates, events, people.
Yeah.
Now, I get bad grades and those kind of things because first, I'm really bad at memorizing dates, really bad at memorizing people, and really bad at memorizing events, especially when I cannot connect them to something tangible.
So you were a bad student?
I was. Still am, perhaps.
Okay.
So in a way, I cannot connect to those stories and memorizing these events because these are, well, let's just say that I'm not very good at accepting propaganda. Maybe that's better.
And then you already knew that it was a propaganda when you were 7 or 6 or 8, because I just found out like...
Of course not.
10 years ago.
If you asked me 10, 20 years ago, I would stand with that propaganda because, I was raised a nationalist.
Yeah.
And at one point you learn, right, and you see these things and you realize, oh, that was a propaganda. That was something that you were forced to accept. It's part of a process of brainwashing in order to smoothen the process of nation building. And once you realize that, then you can see, at least I can see, oh, this is the reason why I cannot connect.
Yeah, very beautifully said. Okay, I see that the audience is very excited to ask questions, so I will invite Anne-Lot Hoek to be back to the stage. We will take Q&A, and you can ask questions in the language that is most comfortable for you, but only 3 languages: English, Dutch, or Indonesian. Not in French, not in German, because... Any questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. Pardon. You mentioned in the beginning, and I would be very interested that that subject is also touched upon, and that is Papua.
Yes.
Yeah, and what I want to know about that, I have a relation through my family.
Okay. So good that you said that, because...
But I want to finish this. The point is that the cruelties and the oppression are enormous there. And sometimes I think, which is against my feelings, my inner feelings, that in the colonial times, the last years of the colonial time, they were better off than they are now. Because the colonial system changed after. Okay, this is a difficult issue, but I want to hear some more, because we should be more in solidarity in this country, I think, with Papua, and we hear very little about it, and we do even less about it.
Yes, great that you mentioned that, because I forgot that. Sorry. Earlier we invited Ligia Judith Giai, but due to COVID, she cannot be here, unfortunately. But we get her message, her voice message, and this is a reflection of revolution from her side as a Papuan. And to give you a little context, Ligia is postgraduate students at Asia Research Center at the Murdoch University, and she is conducting a research on pearl. I cannot read my own handwriting. Pearl shelling in Aru Island between 1870 to 1942. So this is the message from Ligia. It is 5 minutes, and it's only her voice. We will hear about this now.
My name is Ligia Giai. I'm very sorry that I cannot be there live. Unfortunately, like so many people, COVID got me. Also, if anything I say sound disjointed or unclear, I have not finished thinking about this. When Susanna invited me to speak, it took me a while to think about whether I can say anything of use. Let me just begin by saying I'm not a colonial apologist. I believe colonialism was a violent, oppressive system that spared very few. And I'm not surprised that dismantling took violence. People who were involved had that fervor, anger, and desperation, which not a lot of us have experienced. I'm not certain whether people who were there, who experienced it, could replicate or return to that feeling. But yet it still evokes so much emotions among people now. Recently, Boni Triana's article on the Tumbasiak caused a lot of, in the Netherlands, the backlash against it in the Netherlands caused anger among Indonesians. It's clear that the period is sensitive and is loaded with meaning for people on both sides. But very pointedly, this was not shared among Papuans. I could not find one single Papuan who was angry about this. I'm a Papuan who studies history, and I'm still trying to figure out why this period means so little to me emotionally. For me, the Revolusi period is a precursor to the eventual Indonesian takeover of Dutch New Guinea in 1963. There is a part of me that thinks that my reading of this has to do with Indonesian national history education, which has taught me that Papua was quote-unquote saved and integrated to a post-colonial state that was almost complete in the 1960s. Papuans have mostly been absent in Indonesian national history before that. I suspect this is why even after 9 years of Indonesian history education, I cannot master a reading where this period means more for Papuans. At its core is perhaps my strong ambivalence towards colonial of current Indonesia, combined with a deep understanding of what Dutch colonialism was. The Revolusi period saw the clash between the two, and these are two world institutions I have no investment in. And their collision, as violent and as emotional as it was, feels very remote to me. It is Dutch colonial history, it is Indonesian colonial history, it is just not mine. I am a fragment in both, but I feel nothing. This is not to say that I do not understand the emotion around this period. I think I do a little. But my emotional understanding of the period does not have roots in the events itself, but rather in the presence of Papuan circumstances. It is through current circumstances in Papua that I understand what it feels like to be immensely unsatisfied with daily life filled with violence, living with all the land stories about land grabs, journalist restrictions, restrictions on freedom of expression, refugee crisis, and repeated military operations make you sense this seething anger bubbling beneath the surface of everyday interactions. I wonder whether people felt that way during Dutch colonization. I suspect they did. But here, now, at the margin of Indonesia, a lot of Papuans are keenly aware that Indonesia as it is not final. This is not final. We don't have to make do. Don't have to accept things as they are. The legitimacy of this thing, this state, does not hinge on outsiders. It hinges on us. This state, this thing is not legitimate until it is not done until we say it is. So yeah, for me, the violence during the revolution itself is not an outlier. Colonial societies were violent, are violent, and the only measure that was available to hinder these outbursts was actually the prospect of violence itself, violence punishment. Hence, even in my most detached, I agree with Boni Triana. The word Besiap evokes in me the same sense that the word ran amok in the archives do. It is an admission of outburst and the obfuscation of everyday violence. The word and the designation of the period sequesters and removes it from the violence that was always there to maintain colonial order. Because for me, in general, what occurred in the period was not a society descending into chaos. It was a society that revealed itself.
Wow. That were strong words from Ligia. Too bad she cannot be here, because basically she said the same thing as you, that you cannot relate with the history of Indonesia.
Yes. Now, Liga and I met in the Netherlands. We shared similar anger toward many things that happened in our colonial history. At the same time, right now, I'm part of the area that is completely under Indonesia, and Liga is part of the area that is occupied by Indonesia.
Yeah.
So we shared similarities, but also we are in a different position geographically, or by claimed. Now, the emotion. When I speak about the revolution, I try to dig deeper into at least my family history and ask around, like, what actually happened? Did we experience the same thing? And the answer was no. During that period, Maluku was pretty much still under the Dutch power. And it was after 95 was just after, Japanese occupation. So people were still recovering or are still running from the recent war. Many died out of famine and all those kind of things. So revolution, formation of a nation state was quite far from the regular people. It's more in the agenda of the elite, who has this dream of a new state, of what kind of independent state they want to have. But it's quite removed from the experience of everyday life of normal people.
Does it also happen in the Netherlands, Anne-Lot? Because if I see the debates about Indonesia in the Netherlands, it's the debates of the elites, because if you walk out the door and then you go to the market and then you ask random people, hey, what do you think about the bersiap? They would shrug and like, what are you talking about?
In Indonesia, you mean?
No, here in the Netherlands.
Oh, here in the Netherlands.
Like the majority of Dutch people don't even care about the history of Indonesia, I guess.
No.
Or is that too...
I know.
You do care, of course, that you are here, but...
Yeah, but I think it has a lot to do with the education. So I went to, for instance, to the Rijksmuseum to exhibition with my cousin, who is 12 years younger than me, and he had absolutely no idea. I mean, he knows there's a colonial history, but the information is very shallow, and also about Revolusi is very shallow. So for him, it was a very interesting experience to be in that exhibition and to get an idea of what people were doing at that time, and that there was Indonesian freedom fight going on, and to have some images of their perspective of what was going on. For him, that was a completely new experience because it was not in his history book, it was not in my history book. That's one of the reasons that I started this research, because I had absolutely no idea. I mean, you have general idea, but you cannot really grasp. No, you have no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there any question? Yes, please.
Do you like for the Moluccan, as a Moluccan?
Sorry, can you repeat it once more?
What kind of future do you like to have for the Moluccan?
Well, the Moluccan is a very big and diverse community. I am a Moluccan. I don't have the right to speak for all Moluccans, not even half of them. What kind of future? I'd like a future. I teach and I do research, and one of my why I do this kind of things is for transformation. I think for the future, it's important that first we heal ourselves from all the traumatic experience that was the result of uprooting as a result of the colonial violence, of hundreds of years being erased and uprooted and then being told that you are something else. Because until now, even when we try to define Moluccan identity or culture, we cannot define it without actually putting it in the frame of the Indonesian national state or in relation to the colonial past. I'd like a future where we can be ourselves without having to link to someone else.
Yes, an applause.
Let's go. Yes.
Wait a minute, so I can...
Sorry, isn't that always the case? And it goes for everybody. The Dutch, we were talking about the Dutch all the time, but most of us are the Dutch, no? We freed ourselves from the Spanish. We were a colony. And the funny thing is, in the introductory text in the Rijksmuseum, it says, the Netherlands occupied Indonesia for 350 years. You know, in the beginning of the 17th century, the Netherlands didn't exist. It was 7 provinces. Indonesia didn't exist. It were Mataram, you know, this kingdoms that were fighting among themselves. Indonesia is a colonial construct, you know, and Papua is a victim. The Republiek was a Javanese interest. And there was a struggle for freedom in Sumatra, a struggle for freedom on Celebes, Sulawesi. On the Moluccans, Timor-Leste, not to forget, and Papua, that had this election, or, you know, they could vote. But was it really free? I think colonialism is an attitude that is passed on all the time, you know? Yes. From the Spanish to the Dutch.
From the Dutch
to the Javanese. From the Javanese maybe to the Muslim Moluccans or the Christian Moluccans that fight among themselves. You know, it goes on and on. And I think revolution has to take place all the time in every person, you know, to free ourselves from our prejudices.
I see that, mevrouw, do you want to say something? Because you might not agree with, yes? Wait a minute.
There's a difference between colonialism and that is not that was not in the early Renaissance and the late Middle Ages. That there was no colonialism from Spanish colonists from the Netherlands. That's not the case. So there was a revolution or an opstand in Dutch, but that's different from freeing yourself from colonists.
Okay.
I think.
Okay, please.
I would like to ask about Indonesia and Moluccans, something like that. I think 3 of us are grown up in Indonesia. We went to the same school. We learned about the history, the same. And like we live already in Netherlands for a while. And the term of bersiap, we don't know that in Indonesia. I'm surprised when everybody say, do you understand about bersiap? Say, no way. Because between 45 until 48, in Indonesia fighting, we like to be free. We are already free. Why the Dutch come back to us? And what's interesting me, when I'm here, I saw in it a Moluccan and RMS are still alive. When we are in Indonesia, we don't know about that because everything is erased maybe. And here I know I have a lot of Moluccan friends and we talk about that. What I nowadays very interested or curious is, for example, that a Molucca of Sulawesi have a chance to be independent like Timor. Do you think that the Molucca will be ready or really like to do that? And if Molucca be free like Timor, do you think that all Molucca people who live in Netherlands will come back to Molucca to celebrate it? That's it. Just I'm curious how the young generation think about that, of this kind of opinions. Thank you.
That's a very difficult question. I'm happy I don't have to answer that, please.
Well, I completely agree with the gentleman that revolution is a process that is ongoing and cannot be finished. And that's the dream of everybody, I think. You also mentioned about the Netherlands and Spanish. Now it's a long debate whether it's colonialism, imperialism, and all those kind of things. But the violence is there, and I think to a certain extent we can understand the sentiment. Now, the question about whether independence, what does it mean? Does it mean separating yourself from the current state and then form another state? In that sense, I don't see that as an independence, because you pointed out that, for example, before colonialism, these are different states. The Netherlands were not the Netherlands that we know today. Europe was very different as well. Then after that, the nation state takes place, and then it started also in Western Europe. And then once the former colonies become independent, then the only way out, you cannot return to the previous state's formation, but the only way out is to become a nation state, because that's the modern version. So now, and that's the system everywhere, and that is, for me, is a continuation of coloniality, the continuation of colonial logic. You no longer have options. You have to follow that path. And in that sense, it doesn't matter whether it's the Dutch or Indonesia or Jakarta, the system remains the same. That's why I myself would question, did we really do revolution? because revolution is about changing the system. If it's just changing faces or changing the one in power, then is that really revolution? Now, I cannot answer for all Moluccans again, but I think we have to see the case of East Timor very differently with the case, and also the case of West Papua in a very different light. The history, the trajectory, the process of transfer of us from one power to the other were very different. Now, Maluku, do I believe that independence or separating from the state would mean independence? I honestly don't, because it just means changing of name of the state, but we will end up with the same system of nation state and become part of the global system of an organization of nation states where we will still remain at the periphery. And the center also remain the same. So it's just, cutting the cakes into smaller pieces. The system remains, the faces changes. That's it. And worst part is that then all this other part that we inherited from the colonial time would be clear cut, and whatever happened after that would be the responsible of the new nation state. And you can no longer say that, well, this is the remnant of the past.
Yeah.
If I made myself clear. Okay.
I wonder where you mentioned it about RMS, I guess. Where does it fit in this story?
Now, RMS comes after revolution, right?
Yeah.
It's a story of Indonesian nation state and then the Republic of Southern Maluku. It's a story that is often put in binary of nationalist or separatist. But the separatists are also nationalists. It's just that their affiliation is a different nation. Now, I come from second generation from one side of my parent, but also third generation from the other side of the parent who experienced this period. After that period of time, I grew up in Maluku, never really heard about this word. This is not something that you can speak about in the open. This is a word that you shouldn't mention because it has consequences. The war on RMS, from what I heard from the elders that I know, was that it's a total destruction, it's a total purging, it's a total erasure. So when the military of Indonesia came, everybody was assumed RMS, and many those who died or tortured during this period were not necessarily politically affiliated themselves with RMS, but they're assumed as RMS anyway. Now, growing up under the NKRI, this is a forbidden word. It came again so in my family, we never talk about this period. And if you go to the Netherlands, you have to be very careful not to be pictured together with the flag, for example, because that would have consequences when you return home. Like you're already labeled a traitor, right? Affiliated with the Dutch, and now with RMS and all those kind of things, you're separatist. So you have to be very careful not to be associated in any way with this group of separatists, because you're supposed to be nationalist. Now, the word started to appear again in the context of Maluku during the conflict. How? Why? There's a lot of different narratives about that.
And that was in 1999 when
yes, but I think the word the RMS started to become something that exists again in Maluku, perhaps from 2000, 2001, I might be mistaken.
Okay, but can I ask what the sentiment is in Maluku about RMS?
I think the sentiment is never black and white, and this is not only about RMS, it's also about the Indonesian nation state, it's also about the Japanese occupation, it's also about the Dutch. Now, when I first encountered the colonial history, my first reaction was, this is super violence. Why do my family, for example, who were educated under the Dutch system, speaks Dutch, why would they affiliate themselves with these people? Why were they loyal to the Dutch? But then, the more you question it, then you find out that they were not actually loyal to the Dutch. They have mixed emotions. They didn't come to the Dutch and give their heart. They were forced to work for the Dutch. Now, if I ask my elders, what's your sentiment toward the Dutch? We don't really like them. Why? They're liars and they're racist. So first, Japanese occupation, another story. With the Indonesian Republic, same story. You are used to promises that were never met. You're used to discriminations. You're used to be put toward the margins. So the sentiments is, with Indonesia, I think it's almost like a forced marriage. You didn't choose forced marriage.
Oh, forced marriage, okay.
You didn't choose that one, but you make it work anyway because you have to. Now, with RMS, it's also the same thing, I think. It's not either or. It's not that you don't like this one, that means you're supporting that one.
Yeah. Any other question from the... Yes, please.
Why you speak about forced marriage?
It just came to mind, sorry, if it offend anyone.
Doesn't sound very happy, so...
Sorry.
Please.
Voor mij betekent revolutie in Indonesië iets heel groots, iets heel belangrijks, omdat mijn eigen familie daaraan heeft meegeholpen, zeg maar. Ook familie van mij zijn gedood in de revolutie. Dus het heeft een hele emotionele waarde voor mij. Tegelijkertijd herinner ik mij de woorden van mijn vader. Mijn vader was hier als Indonesiër tijdens de Tweede Wereldoorlog als student. Was hij hier in het verzet gegaan tegen de Duitsers.
Ja.
Hij ging weer terug naar Indonesië samen met mijn moeder, een Nederlandse vrouw. Komt daar midden in een oorlog terecht. Daar waren de Nederlanders gevangen gezet. Later, Indonesië is republiek geworden. Hij werkte voor de republiek. Was er een omkeer van Sukarno naar Suharto. En hij werd gevangen gezet. En weer zat hij in dezelfde situatie. Dan denk je van, heb ik gevraagd aan mijn vader, hoe hou je dat dan vol? Eerst ondergedoken, omdat je Joodse kinderen hebt geholpen hier in de Tweede Wereldoorlog in Nederland. Samen met de Nederlanders die ook in het verzet zaten. In Indonesië zelf gevangen door de Nederlanders. In Indonesië, waar je familie zoveel voor heeft gedaan en geleden, gevangen gezet weer door je eigen mensen, door de Indonesiërs. Hij zegt, voor mij is het heel simpel. Ik ben een antifascist. En antifascisten is een ander woord, is een andere manier van denken. Dan denk je niet in Indonesiër, Nederlander, Japanner of wat dan ook. Dan denk je breder dan dat. Je hebt een mening, je hebt een overtuiging. Ik ben een antifascist. Ja. En een Indonesiër kan fascist zijn.
Very beautifully said. En de meneer hierachter.
Ja, we hebben net ook samen gepraat, want mijn vader zat ook in het verzet tegen de Duitsers. En die ging daarna naar Indonesië, omdat hij Indonesië wilde bevrijden van het kolonialisme. Hij heeft er met Suharto onderhandeld. Hij heeft de geheime dingen verteld. Nee, Suharto, wat zeg ik nou, sorry. Sharia, sorry,
Sharia.
Fout. Okay. En dat is allemaal geheim, anders was hij dood geweest natuurlijk. En ik heb een boek hier bij me ook, wat getekend is door Sharia, waarin Sharia beschrijft wat hij in de gevangenis gedaan, 1934, 1935. En hij heeft dus meegeholpen aan dat Linggadjati-akkoord. Mm-hmm. Wat gebeurt er? Het Nederlands parlement gaat daar tegenin en er worden politische acties beginnen. Nou, dat heeft mijn vader, maar heel veel ouders van jullie hebben dat allemaal aangezien. We gingen verbinden en het werd allemaal verbroken. Vreselijk was dat.
Ja. Yeah, but it is very special that your family has a rich historical stories. Because if I look at my family, it's very boring. Like my grandfather fought for Indonesia under Sudirman, but that's all I know. And maybe we should treasure these stories, as you said before.
Yes, and in a way, what you said about fascism, in one of our discussions prior to this, I mentioned that nationalism is a disease. And because then nation states interest above all. And part of the colonialism that resulted also in fascism and related with nationalism is segregation. And segregation relies on purity of the origin. And in that sense, when you're mixed, your goal gains disorder. And you will be neither here or there. So usually the option is that I don't like both. Because both can result in violence.
Yeah. How do you see it, Anne-Lot?
Yeah, I think the stories of Mariani, I know the story very well, and this is also a very interesting story. And these were the things that interested me so much when I came across these histories, because I had no idea that it was so complicated, and that these beautiful stories were also there. And that's what I also found on Bali, that there were anti-German resistance fighters who ended up in this war with completely different ideas and tried to uphold these principles that they had from the Second World War in the revolution period, and trying to make other Dutch people understand what was going on there, and that is very difficult. And I think the whole situation of Indonesians being here during the Second World War, going to Indonesia, like Mariani, that's a story that is completely neglected, and that we should really integrate in the history books.
Yeah. So there are a lot of stories that doesn't make it to the history.
Yeah.
And are there any questions from the yes?
I have one more last question. How many people read this book?
I think many people have it. But we should talk about this book instead of that book tonight. So this is Anne-Lot's book. I will put it here. And Anne-Lot, you also mentioned about the missionary who came to Bali as well, and that they made a connection between the resistance here in the Netherlands to the resistance there in Bali. Can you tell us about it?
I think you mean Henk Franke, the one from the...
Yes, I think,
Yeah. What you see is that the former resistance fighters like Henk Franke, but also Siebe Lijftocht, who was also on Bali, he was a civil servant, they tried to reach out to people in the Netherlands who were in power, and to inform them about what was going on Bali, and that their idea of this war was completely false, and we were doing something completely wrong, and we should, go out of Indonesia. And it's interesting that especially Siebe Lijftocht, he wrote letters to his former leaders from the resistance, like Marianne Tellege. At that point, she was like the right hand of the Queen. Lambertus Neyer, who was very high in the government in Indonesia at that time. So, and these letters are very, very interesting to read, because he was so clear on what was going on, and you can see that the elites at that time had, even if they were in the Second World War before, they had a completely blurred vision, and they sort of had the idea that they got very angry when he compared our behavior with the Nazis. They became completely, it was like, how can you do that? But they were unable, because they had so much in mind that what we're doing there had a good intention. So that made it all different. And that's what, Siebe Lijftocht and Henk Franke tried to explain to them, that there's not a good intention here. And, we have to see the violence for what it is, and the political motivations that we have here for what it was.
Yeah.
And that's very interesting to read. Yeah.
Can the Netherlands already face the revolution? I mean, like you said about the violence, we have to see it just as it was. Is it already happening here in the Netherlands?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that I've been working on this subject for 10 years now. In these 10 years, I've seen it moving a lot. So yeah, there's much more discussion now. There's much more, books like Revolusi, for instance, and films.
And the strijd om Bali.
So there's, it has become a topic that has got much more attention than before. At the same time, there's also opposition from certain groups who still don't want to acknowledge that message and still see the war as two equal groups facing each other, and they don't understand the colonial prehistory that's before that. And it's very difficult discussion, and tomorrow we have the results of a project coming up. I'm very curious myself what they're going to present and how the responses will be from the public.
Yeah. So, and Tamara, you see here in the Netherlands, as Anne-Lot mentioned, there are a lot of discussions about Indonesia. But do you think that discussion about decoloniality is also alive among the Indonesians in Indonesia?
Now, decoloniality is thinking and doing. Now, in Indonesia, and I think also here, the name is new perhaps, but the practices are there. People do practices that, bring stories that are not part of the grand narratives. People do things to heal themselves and their family from the colonial and trauma of colonial violence and other things. People do things to make bridges and to make connections and to break segregation and to, make relations. So the practice are there. Now, the discussion perhaps, if we do discuss this, we don't necessarily use the word decolonization or decoloniality, but that doesn't mean that it's not being discussed. So I think, yes, things are moving, although perhaps not at the nation-state level, because at the nation-state level, nation building is still very strong, and we shouldn't forget the fact that Liga was here, and our debate with the Netherlands right now, is also the same thing that is going on between Indonesia and West Papua, in a way.
So Indonesia has also many things to do, I guess, in regarding coloniality and decoloniality, because you see the pattern, just as we discussed, like the colonialism is still there in Indonesia.
Yes, I think the logic is still there. The practice is still very much there. And I don't think it's something, because the moment you discuss to dismantle colonialism and everything, you question the whole thing, the essence of a nation state. And when you question the essence of the nation state, what would become of the nation state?
Yes, of course.
Part of the big narrative that you were talking about is a part of the big narrative is there is also something hidden that is actually in plain sight, and that has to do with a kind of colonialism that has taken on a new shape, and it's the shape of the IMF,
of course,
the World Bank. Nations that became independent needed something to put an economy, to start it. They got loans with, how do you say it, voorwaarden, conditions that they could never meet. So they were dependent again. And it goes on, and it is happening all the time. And now this confrontation between Putin and America also has to do with that, because Putin is somebody that stands up to this neoliberal construct, which is in a way destroying.
Yes, and from Russia we come back to Indonesia.
Should I?
Tamara, wait. Okay,
Do you want to-
Tamara, this is we don't have much time left, so we are going to. Okay, we are going to wrap up here. Tamara, Anne-Lot, last question for you, because you also mentioned about accountability, and you mentioned that the politics never take responsibility up until now.
Ooh,
That's a very interesting
that's an interesting
statement.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's. I have the feeling that in the Netherlands the discussion is mainly about what the military has done, and of course it's a logical thing maybe, but I somehow sort of find it very interesting that we have so less discussion about certain politicians who are responsible, and I think that it's more important to point out that it was actually how do you say that in English? Misdadig. No, without wanting to sound too activistic, I do think after 7-year research, I can say it was a criminal act to start this war in Indonesia. And you can, turn the clock 10 times, but this is the main focal point. Yeah. And I think that sometimes is being forgotten, and that we start discussing about which is also, of course, I don't want to say anything about the military. Of course, I've seen in my book it was a terrible situation, and the violence was very, very intense, and military commanders were in charge, and they inflicted the violence. But at the end, who sent them there? And that is an important question, I think, and especially if you start looking at the federal policy of Van Mook, I found out in my book that these political aims were very much aligned with the violence on the ground. And that's something we don't really, sort of, we don't understand, that because we wanted something politically, this is what it ended up military on the ground. Yeah. So, and that's, I think it would be very interesting for us also to understand that some prime ministers who are actually very popular in the Netherlands have done stuff that other peoples from not Western countries are putting in front of tribunals here in the Netherlands. So, that's a discussion we must have, I think.
Yes, and that's the politics. Now I get to Tamara for the last question. What can we do ourselves if we cannot hope for politics to do something? What can we do ourselves to decolonize?
Okay, quickly, sir. Development, that's going to be a 2-hour answer. But I would just briefly say development as a paradigm is a continuation of colonization. Now, what do we do? I think first thing is to ask questions. The more questions you ask, the more things unfold.
But which question do we have to ask?
It's a very simple question. What is your story? And I think to open spaces like this, to encounter people and to understand them not as part of a certain nation, but as individuals, as people, as human beings with their stories. Do I expect the state to do something? No. Why would I expect something that was built until that, on top of that the foundation of colonialism, to solve its problem? It's not going to be done. I think it's more about the people to decide our own future. What do we want? To decide on the stories, to make options ourselves that are out of these two narratives. Because these two narratives can only, or the meta-narratives can only be there if they're supported. If there's no support, if you start to build your own narratives, that would collapse on its own.
Okay. Let that sink in. That was a perfect answer to end this evening. And as I said in the beginning, the poem of Hyrule Anwar depicts very much the struggles and the spirits of the I, the aku. And I think tonight we have seen all the struggles, all the spirits in the people who were involved in the Revolusi. Thank you so much for coming. And this program is once again organized by Beyond Walls and facilitated by the Hoed. Don't forget to follow them on socials, Instagram, Facebook, beyondwalls.nl, and Twitter, beyondwalls_NL. I don't think they have TikTok, so you don't have TikTok. Okay. Not yet, so thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you for the discussion.
Yes, I think people.